So every time we clean out our hall closet, I consider getting rid of this blue hand knit blanket. It's not a nice shade of blue. It's kind of an industrial, mass produced blue, like a Cheer laundry bottle. You know what I mean? It's definitely not a nice periwinkle or indigo or navy. Also, it's made of acrylic. I never realized I was a yarn snob, but if you're going to knit a blanket, wouldn't you want to use cotton or wool or like alpaca? So I'm not saying there's not a time and place for synthetics. It's just that if I'm going to cozy up with a hand knit blanket, I'd like it to be made of natural fibers. So lastly, the reason that I am not crazy about this blanket is that it was knit by my Aunt Esther, who died holding a grudge against me. So let me tell you a little bit about Esther. Esther was my dad's sister, and she was the eldest of the 7 children in their family. They grew up in eastern Washington state during the Depression, and the stories that I heard about my dad's childhood was that they were so poor they only had goat's milk to drink, and they sometimes didn't have shoes. So my grandfather, who was this ruddy-faced, barrel-chested Norwegian immigrant, he did have a job working on the railroad, but apparently he spent the little money that they had on his booze and this mistress named Minnie that everybody knew about. So it was really my grandmother, with my aunt's help, who had to try to feed the family and get all those grubby little kids to school. So it sounded like it was a tough life. So my dad was an older dad. He was 20 years older than my mom. So by that standard, Esther was ancient. Like, I remember her as this pudgy, pink-faced lady with this kinky white hair, which must have been some sort of cheap perm. Esther lived in Spokane, in the same town in eastern Washington where the family had grown up, and she had a husband named Mark, who actually I thought Mark was a super nice man. He had this great smile, and he loved telling us stories, like the Greek soldiers who hid themselves in the horse to take over the city of Troy. Esther, on the other hand, I felt like, always sort of watching me and waiting for me to act like a brat, which is, I think, what she thought I was. So anyway, she was like a conscientious relative. She always sent Christmas cards and remembered my birthday, and she gave me a gift when I graduated from high school, which turns out was the reason she held a grudge against me. So I don't really remember that much about Esther and Mark after a certain point. You know, some relatives, don't play super prominently in your life. So as the years went by, we still got their Christmas cards. My dad would occasionally relay something about their health, a heart operation, a hip replacement, cancer scare. And during this time, Esther began to pass on her family possessions. So one day we got in the mail a copy of my grandfather's immigration papers when he immigrated from Norway to Angel Island in San Francisco. And I think it was around this time that the blue hand knit blanket also came my way. So one day, I don't know, I must have been, this was not that long ago, so I was in my 40s. My dad called and asked me if I would like a traditional Norwegian dress that my grandmother had sewn by hand. And it had been handed down to Aunt Esther, who, now that her health was failing, really wanted another female member of the family to have it and keep it in the family. And this, I felt actually honored. I love the idea of having a physical object tie me to my grandmother, who died when I was only 8, and also have a tie to my Norwegian heritage and to all the other women in my family. And I felt a newfound affection for Aunt Esther, this sort of cranky person who I'd never felt particularly was very warm to me. I mean, she was my blood. So I thought about how I would display this dress in the house. Like, I thought about getting one of those glass shadow boxes and having it in the living room, and how my My own young daughters would love looking at it. But the next time I talked to my dad, he hesitated when I asked him about the dress. Esther changed her mind, he said. I guess she gave you a present when you graduated from high school and you never sent a thank you note. A thank you note? From high school. It was like 20 years ago. I was like a teenager. I was like a kid. All teenagers are rude, aren't they? I mean, why would you make that be the reason to not share this very important object with your niece? So anyway, my affection for Esther went out the window. All I could think of was her pink, pinched face and the permed hair. And it was clear to me at that point that she had never liked me. So Esther died sometime after that. And I did feel sad for my dad, but mostly I just felt better. I felt judged and I felt angry. And honestly, I felt embarrassed. I'm sure that whatever she had given me as a high school graduation gift had been really nice. And even if it wasn't, even if it was one of those gifts that you just look at and shove in a closet or a drawer, I hadn't even taken 10 or 15 minutes to acknowledge her act of kindness. So one day I opened up the hall closet and I saw Aunt Esther's blanket on the top shelf. And I had this wave of negative emotions rise up inside of me. And I thought, I am going to throw that blue blanket away, that stupid blue blanket. And I think that some part of my mind thought, I will show her. I'll get the last word in this battle with this deceased aunt of mine. But then I stopped. And in that moment, I realized that if I got rid of the blanket and kept hating Aunt Esther for the rest of my life, I would just be perpetuating a negative cycle where I alone would lose. Esther died holding a grudge against me, and who knows what other people. And that, quite frankly, made me feel really sad. And I realized that I didn't want to feel like that. I didn't want to be that person. So it's interesting because I feel like once a crack of compassion opens up in you, it's so much easier to consider another person's perspective. Esther had a hard life. And when I would ask my dad questions about my grandfather, he'd say, well, you really need to ask Esther about that, but she doesn't want to talk about dad at all. So, in addition to the financial hardships they had experienced, my grandfather's adultery, there had also been stories about domestic abuse. And, I can only imagine what it would have been like for Esther as this young girl to have witnessed this and also to be responsible for raising her younger siblings, basically. So, in that moment, I could see why she would be resentful of a 17-year-old privileged kid who, didn't even take the time to say thank you. So at the end of the day, I forgave Esther for deciding not to give me the Norwegian dress. And I also forgave her for holding the grudge against me. Because even though the blanket is still not my favorite color or fabric, I appreciate that Esther made it with her own hands. And likely with a lot of love.